Welcome to Life Stories, where we share powerful tales of courage, hope, and the triumph of the human spirit. In today's story, a routine traffic stop in a quiet suburban town turns into a race against time as Officer Harris uncovers a sinister truth. What starts as a simple warning spirals into a gripping journey to save a young girl and bring justice to those who prey on the innocent. Stay with us as we explore a story of resilience, love, and the extraordinary strength of one officer's determination. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to begin today's journey. It was a quiet evening in Brooksville, Illinois. The kind of night that lulled you into believing nothing could go wrong. My name's Michael Harris, and I've been an officer with the Brooksville Police Department for nearly a decade. Over the years, I've learned that it's often on these deceptively peaceful nights when life throws you its darkest surprises. The clock on my dashboard glowed softly, 8:43 p.m. I'd been patrolling the suburban streets, the gentle hum of the engine keeping me company, broken occasionally by the faint crackle of my radio. Routine. Monotonous. The sort of shift that makes you long for a hot coffee and an early night. But something about the stillness that night felt off. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was the lingering awareness that quiet nights often mask unseen troubles. It was at an intersection on Lakeview Drive when I spotted it, an old sedan. A dull grey model. Rolling through a stop sign without even a hint of hesitation. A minor infraction. Nothing major. But a stop sign is a stop sign. I sighed and flicked on the patrol lights, signaling the driver to pull over. The car slowed and obediently pulled to the shoulder. As I stepped out, the cool night air greeted me. It wasn't cold, but the slight chill heightened my senses. My boots crunched against the gravel as I approached the driver's side window, my eyes sweeping over the vehicle for anything unusual. The window rolled down smoothly, and I was greeted by the smiling face of a man, mid-40s, with neatly combed hair and an air of forced calmness. He was dressed too sharply for the hour, pressed shirt, tidy slacks. "Good evening, officer," he said in a voice so warm and measured it felt rehearsed. "Is something wrong?" I kept my tone neutral. "Evening. You ran a stop sign back there. Any reason for the rush?" The man chuckled nervously, his polished demeanor slipping just slightly. "I apologize. It's been a long day. Just trying to get home. You know how it is." I nodded, noting the faint sheen of sweat on his forehead. Despite the coolness of the night. "License and registration, please." He reached into the glove compartment without hesitation, handing me the documents. "Name's James Walters," he offered smoothly. "And this here is my daughter Abigail." I glanced into the back seat and saw her, a small girl, maybe 7 years old, clutching a doll so tightly her knuckles were white. Her blonde hair fell in soft waves around her pale face, her small frame seemingly swallowed by the car seat. She offered me a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. It was the kind of smile you learn to spot in this line of work. A mask. A defense. "Abigail." I said, leaning slightly to meet her gaze. "You doing okay back there?" Her smile faltered for the briefest moment, and she gave a small nod. "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice so quiet it was almost lost in the night. Before I could press further, Walters chimed in, his tone light. "She's just tired, officer. Long night. You know how kids are." I returned my attention to him, studying his face. There was something about him, too polished, too controlled. "Where's home?" I asked. "Just outside town," he replied, almost too quickly. "Meadowbrook Lane." Everything on the license and registration checked out. James Walters. Meadowbrook Lane. A car registered in his name. On paper, it was all in order. But my gut screamed otherwise. I noticed Abigail flinch slightly when Walters glanced back at her. A subtle movement that wouldn't mean much to most. But to me, it spoke volumes. Her body was stiff, as if she wanted to disappear into the seat. And the way she clung to that doll. It wasn't the comfort of a tired child. It was the grip of someone scared, desperately holding on to something familiar. "You seem like a nice family man, Mr. Walters," I said, testing the waters. "Not often I see a father and daughter out this late." He chuckled again, the sound hollow. "Well, family dinners can run late, you know, but family's important." I forced a polite nod. "Of course. Just a heads up. Though, make sure you come to a full stop at those signs. It's for everyone's safety." Walters nodded quickly. "Absolutely, officer. Won't happen again." I stepped back from the car, my unease growing. I wanted to press further, but without a clear reason to detain them. I couldn't justify it. "All right. You're good to go. Drive safe." "Thank you, officer." "You have a good night," he replied, smiling a little too wide. As the sedan pulled away, I stood there watching its taillights fade into the darkness. My hand unconsciously rested on my holster, and the unease in my chest refused to leave. Back in my cruiser, I jotted down the license plate number, 4B9X991. My instincts were honed from years on the job, and they were screaming at me that something was wrong. But I didn't know what. The silence of the night returned, wrapping itself around me like a heavy blanket. Yet, the image of Abigail stayed with me, her faint, hollow smile. The way her hands gripped that doll like her life depended on it. Something wasn't right. I just didn't know what yet. As I drove back toward the station, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just let something slip through my fingers. Back at the station, the fluorescent lights cast their usual cold, sterile glow over the quiet precinct. It was close to 9:30 p.m., and most of the night crew were either out on patrol or buried under paperwork. I settled into my desk, but my mind wasn't on the reports in front of me. My thoughts kept drifting back to that old sedan, to James Walters's overly polished demeanor, and most of all, to the little girl in the back seat, Abigail. Her pale face, the doll clutched tightly in her hands, the way her body seemed frozen in the seat like she was trying to disappear, none of it sat right with me. I leaned back in my chair and rubbed my temples, replaying the scene over and over in my head. On the surface, there hadn't been anything concrete to act on. Walters's license and registration were in order, and Abigail hadn't said anything that would raise alarms. But it wasn't what she said. It was everything she didn't say. I opened my notebook and flipped to the page where I had scribbled down the license plate number, 4B9X991. My gut told me I needed to dig deeper. And over the years, I'd learned never to ignore my instincts. I typed the plate into the state database and leaned forward, tapping my pen against the desk as I waited for the results. The unease in my chest grew stronger with every passing second. When the search results finally appeared, everything seemed routine at first glance. The car was registered to James Walters at an address on Meadowbrook Lane, just like he'd said. No prior arrests, no citations, clean as a whistle. But appearances could be deceiving. I pulled up the dashcam footage from my patrol car, wanting to see if I'd missed something. The grainy video played on my screen, and there he was, James Walters, smiling too wide, his every word calculated and smooth. Fast-forwarding to the part where I spoke to Abigail, I paused the video on her face. Her faint smile was there, but it was a mask, a poor attempt at normalcy. Her eyes darted around the car, never meeting mine, like she was searching for an escape. As I studied the footage, something caught my eye. Abigail's lips moved for the briefest moment, just as she clutched her doll tighter. I rewound the clip and played it again, slower this time. 2 words. "Help me." The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I froze, staring at the screen as the weight of those words settled over me. Abigail had tried to communicate, to reach out without drawing attention to herself. I clenched my fists, anger and regret rising in equal measure. She'd been asking for help, and I'd let them drive away, without wasting another second. I expanded the search on Walters, widening it to include other counties and states. If he was clean in Illinois, maybe his past wasn't as spotless elsewhere. The results started to paint a darker picture. Walters's name came up in several reports, none of which had led to charges but all of which hinted at something sinister. Interviews in connection to missing children. Anonymous tips describing suspicious behavior around playgrounds. A witness in Ohio who'd claimed to see him leaving a park with a child who later vanished. My chest tightened as I scrolled through the files. The pattern was there, glaringly clear. Wherever Walters went, children disappeared. I sat back, my heart pounding. While there was no hard evidence linking him to any specific crime, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Abigail wasn't his daughter. She wasn't just a tired child heading home after a family dinner. She was a victim. I opened a separate window on my computer and searched for recent Amber alerts. My stomach dropped when I found one from Ridgewood, Indiana. Issued 3 days ago. Emily Harper. Age 7. Blonde hair. Blue eyes. Last seen at a playground. Wearing a pink dress and holding a doll. The description was a perfect match. The report detailed how Emily had vanished while playing with friends. Witnesses described seeing a man in a dark sedan near the playground shortly before she disappeared. My hands tightened into fists as I stared at the screen. Abigail wasn't Abigail. She was Emily Harper. A missing child. And James Walters wasn't her father. He was her abductor. I stood abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. Grabbing my radio, I called dispatch, my voice tight with urgency. This is Officer Harris. I need an APB on a dark sedan. License plate 4B9X991. Registered to James Walters. Possible abduction case. The child matches an active Amber alert. Notify Ridgewood PD and coordinate immediately. Copy that. Officer Harris, the dispatcher replied. Her tone sharp and alert. Sending out the bulletin now. I paced the precinct. My mind racing. I couldn't just sit here and wait for backup. Emily's life was on the line. And every second counted. Pulling up a map of the area, I traced potential routes Walters might take. Meadowbrook Lane was listed as his address. But he wouldn't go there if he knew the police were looking for him. He wasn't an amateur. He'd been evading authorities for years. And he wasn't going to lead us to his doorstep. I thought back to the traffic stop, replaying every detail. Walters had been calm, too calm. People who had something to hide often overcompensated. And Emily's silence. Her stilted movements. Those weren't the behaviors of a sleepy child. They were the actions of someone terrified. Someone trying not to provoke her captor. I needed to act. I grabbed my jacket. My resolve hardening. I didn't know where Walters was heading. But I was going to find him. The image of Emily whispering helped me burn in my mind as I stepped into the night. I wouldn't let her down again. The quiet streets of Brooksville blurred past as I sped down the main road. My mind racing. The image of Emily Harper, clutching her doll and whispering help me, was seared into my thoughts. Every instinct screamed that time was running out. She was out there, somewhere in the dark. And I wasn't going to let her disappear. My radio crackled as Detective Laura Mitchell's voice came through. Calm but firm. Michael. I got your message. Amber alert confirmed. Ridgewood PD is sending us the case files now. What's the plan? I can't just sit and wait, I said, my voice tight with determination. I'm heading out to track Walters. He's been linked to similar cases in multiple states. If his pattern holds, he's got a system. He won't take unnecessary risks. And he's probably heading somewhere secluded. Somewhere he knows we won't find him easily. Agreed. Laura replied. We'll need to think like him. Any leads? There's a place, I said, recalling the address linked to Walters's name. An old hunting cabin outside town, owned by a relative. It hasn't been used in years, but it's isolated enough to keep him off the radar. I'm heading there now. Be careful. Laura warned. I'll meet you there with backup. Don't go in alone. I promised her I wouldn't. Though I already knew I'd act the moment I found Walters. Emily didn't have the luxury of waiting. And neither did I. The drive to the cabin felt endless. The unpaved road winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around me. My headlights barely cut through the thick darkness. And the silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional rustle of branches. Finally, the cabin came into view, a dilapidated wooden structure that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. The roof sagged under the weight of time, and the windows were boarded up, giving the place an eerie, lifeless appearance. I parked a distance away, stepping out of my cruiser and onto the overgrown path leading to the cabin. My flashlight swept across the area, illuminating every shadow and corner. The stillness was unnerving, but I pressed forward, each step heavier than the last. The front door hung slightly ajar, creaking as the wind brushed against it. I approached cautiously, my hand resting on the grip of my holstered weapon. The air felt heavy, charged with the weight of something unseen. Brooksville PD. I called out, my voice firm and steady. If anyone's in there, show yourself. Silence. I pushed the door open, the wood groaning under my touch. The inside was barren, filled with dust and cobwebs. Broken furniture lay scattered, and the smell of damp wood lingered in the air. It was clear no one had been here in years. Still, I searched every corner, refusing to leave without being certain. But the cabin was empty. Nothing but a dead end. Frustration bubbled inside me as I stepped back outside. If Walters wasn't here, then where? He wasn't the type to stay on the move aimlessly. He'd have a destination in mind. Somewhere he thought was safe. My radio crackled to life again. Laura's voice cutting through. Michael. Any sign of them? Nothing, I said, shaking my head even though she couldn't see me. The cabin's empty. Laura cursed softly under her breath. We'll regroup. Walters is careful, but he's not infallible. We'll find him. As I returned to my cruiser, my mind replayed every detail of the traffic stop. Walters had been too composed, too polite. He was hiding something. And Emily's every movement screamed fear. Then it hit me. The diner. Walters had mentioned being out late for a family dinner. But something about the way he said it felt off. He'd been quick to explain. Almost rehearsed. What if he'd been there earlier? Laura. I said into the radio. My voice sharp. I'm heading to the diner off Highway 9. It's not far from where I stopped him. If he was passing through, someone there might have seen him. On it, she replied. I'll check in with dispatch and see if they've picked up anything new. Keep me updated. The diner came into view not long after, its flickering neon sign casting an eerie glow over the empty parking lot. I parked and stepped inside, the smell of coffee and fried food washing over me. Behind the counter, a waitress with tired eyes and a name tag that read Linda glanced up from wiping a table. Evening. Officer. What can I do for you? Good evening, I said, flashing my badge. I'm looking for a man who might have passed through here earlier tonight. Mid-40s. White. Dark sedan. He was traveling with a young girl. Blonde. About 7 years old. Linda frowned, her brow creasing as she thought. Yeah. I remember them. They were here a few hours ago. The guy ordered coffee and a burger. But he was off. Kept looking around. Like he was nervous. The girl didn't say much. Just sat there holding her doll. Poor thing looked scared out of her wits. My pulse quickened. Did he say anything? Did you notice which direction they went when they left? Linda nodded slowly. He mentioned needing a place to stay for the night. There's a motel down the highway, Lakeside Inn. It's the only place around here that's open this late. They headed south when they left. I jotted down the details, my hand moving fast. Thank you, Linda. If you remember anything else, give me a call. I handed her my card. my heart pounding as I stepped back outside. The lakeside inn wasn't far. If Walters had stopped there, it might be my chance to find Emily. As I started the cruiser and pulled onto the highway, I forced myself to focus. Every second mattered. Emily's life depended on it. The lakeside inn was exactly what I expected, a grimy, single-story row of rooms. Its neon sign flickering weakly against the night sky. The parking lot was cracked and uneven, with weeds sprouting through the asphalt. A few cars were scattered about, their windows fogged up in the cool night air. I parked near the far end of the lot, cutting the engine and sitting in silence for a moment. My eyes scanned the lot, searching for the dark sedan. It didn't take long to find it, parked near room 12. My heart began to pound. Walters was here. Emily was here. Before I could act, Laura Mitchell's unmarked car pulled in behind me, her headlights briefly sweeping over the lot before she parked and stepped out. She moved quickly but quietly, her expression tense and determined as she approached. "Michael," she said in a low voice, nodding toward the sedan. "That's his car." I nodded. "Room 12. If Emily's in there, we have to act fast." Laura placed a firm hand on my arm, stopping me. "We need to be smart about this. If we rush in, he might panic. And if he panics," she didn't need to finish the sentence. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to rein in the surge of adrenaline. She was right. We couldn't afford to make a mistake. Emily's safety came first. We took up positions across from room 12, staying hidden in the shadows. The curtains were drawn, but faint light seeped through, revealing the silhouettes of two figures inside. Walters was pacing, his movements agitated and restless. Emily sat on the edge of the bed, her small frame hunched, the doll still clutched tightly in her hands. Even from this distance, I could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders curved inward as if she were trying to make herself smaller, less noticeable. My fists clenched at my sides. "Wait for an opening," Laura whispered. Her eyes locked on the room. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. Walters continued to pace, occasionally glancing toward the window as if checking for something or someone. Then, finally, he grabbed a pack of cigarettes from the bedside table and moved toward the door. My heart leapt. This was it. Walters stepped outside, the faint glow of his cigarette illuminating his face. He stood on the small porch, exhaling smoke as he scanned the empty lot, completely unaware of our presence. I looked at Laura, and she nodded. "Now." I moved quickly but quietly, my boots crunching softly against the gravel as I approached. Walters didn't notice me until it was too late. Grabbing him from behind, I twisted his arm and forced him against the wall. The cigarette fell from his lips as he let out a startled yelp of pain. "James Walters," I said, my voice low and firm. "You're under arrest for the abduction of Emily Harper. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Walters struggled, his voice a mixture of panic and defiance. "You've got it all wrong. She's my daughter. Save it," Laura said sharply as she approached, snapping a pair of handcuffs onto his wrists. "We'll sort it out downtown." Walters glared at us, his face twisting with anger. "You don't know what you're doing. You're making a mistake." Ignoring his protests, I hauled him toward the cruiser, leaving Laura to secure the room. But before I could take a breath, a loud noise came from behind the motel, a rustling in the woods that bordered the property. I froze, my senses immediately on high alert. "What the hell was that?" Laura muttered, her hand instinctively moving to her holstered weapon. Before I could answer, the door to room 12 flew open, and Emily bolted out, her small figure darting toward the woods. "Emily," I shouted, my voice cutting through the night. She didn't stop. Her movements were frantic, her silhouette disappearing into the trees within seconds. "Stay with him," I barked to Laura, already moving toward the woods. The forest loomed ahead, dark and shadowy, the dense underbrush swallowing the faint glow of my flashlight. I could hear Emily's small, rapid footsteps and the sound of her ragged breathing. "Emily," I called again, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's Officer Harris. I'm here to help you." A faint whimper reached my ears, barely audible over the pounding of my own heartbeat. I pressed forward, my flashlight sweeping through the tangled branches and twisted roots. The woods felt alive, every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sending my nerves into overdrive. "Emily, it's okay," I said, softening my tone. "You're safe now. Just stay where you are." I spotted a small clearing up ahead and quickened my pace. There, near the base of a tree, was a small figure, crouched and trembling. Relief flooded through me as I stepped closer. "Emily," I said gently, crouching down to her level. She looked up, her tear-streaked face illuminated by the beam of my flashlight. The doll was still clutched tightly in her hands, her knuckles white. "You're safe now," I said softly. "I'm going to take you home." But before I could reach her, a heavy footfall sounded behind me, followed by the unmistakable metallic click of a knife being unsheathed. I turned sharply, my flashlight catching the glint of the blade. A man stepped out of the shadows, his face obscured by a dark hoodie, his posture low and predatory. This wasn't over yet. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the man stepped closer, his blade glinting in the faint light of my flashlight. He was silent, his hood pulled low over his face, his movements deliberate and threatening. I shifted my stance, positioning myself between Emily and this new danger. "Stay back," I said firmly, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. My free hand rested on my holstered weapon, but I didn't draw it. Not yet. The situation was too delicate. The man didn't respond. Instead, he lunged, the knife flashing toward my chest. I twisted to the side, the blade slicing through the air just inches from my shoulder. Without hesitation, I swung my flashlight like a baton, striking his wrist and sending the knife clattering to the forest floor. But he didn't back down. Fueled by desperation, he shoved me backward into a tree, the rough bark digging into my back. Pain shot through me, but I stayed on my feet, grappling with him as he swung wildly, his fists colliding with my arms and torso. "Run, Emily," I shouted over the chaos, my voice breaking through the darkness. "Go now." For a moment, she hesitated, her wide eyes darting between me and the fight unfolding before her. Then, clutching her doll tightly, she turned and darted deeper into the woods, her small figure disappearing into the shadows. The man growled, his focus snapping back to me. He lunged again, his hands clawing for the knife on the ground. I kicked it out of reach, the blade skidding across the dirt, before tackling him to the ground. We rolled through the underbrush, branches and stones scraping against my uniform. He was strong, stronger than I'd anticipated, but years of training kicked in. I managed to pin him, pressing my knee into his back to keep him from squirming free. His breath came in ragged gasps as he struggled beneath me, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. With one hand, I grabbed my radio. "Laura, I need backup in the woods behind the lakeside inn," I barked, my voice tight. "Suspect apprehended. But Emily's still running." "Over. Copy that." "Michael," her voice came back almost immediately. "I'm on my way." The man beneath me let out a guttural scream, bucking violently in an attempt to throw me off. I gritted my teeth, my arm aching from where his nails had raked across my skin, leaving deep scratches. "Stay down," I growled, wrestling his other arm behind his back. I snapped one cuff around his wrist and then the other, securing him as he let out another frustrated yell. The fight was over, but there was no time to dwell on it. Emily was still out there, alone in the dark. I hauled the man to his feet, his face still obscured by the hood of his sweatshirt. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice sharp. Why are you helping him? He sneered, his lips curling into an expression of defiance. You think you're saving her, he said, his voice low and venomous. You don't even know what's out there. I shook him once, my patience wearing thin. Talk, I snapped. But he only laughed. A chilling sound that echoed through the trees. Ignoring his cryptic warning, I began dragging him back toward the motel, my flashlight sweeping through the woods as I searched for any sign of Emily. My arm throbbed where his nails had torn through the fabric of my sleeve. But I pushed the pain aside. Then, as if out of nowhere, Emily emerged from behind a tree, her doll still clutched tightly in her hands. She looked up at me, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her small frame trembling. It's okay, Emily, I said softly, crouching down despite the weight of exhaustion pressing on me. You're safe now. For a moment, she hesitated, her wide eyes filled with fear and uncertainty. But then she ran to me, wrapping her small arms around my neck. Her grip was tight, desperate, and I could feel her tiny body shaking against mine. It's over, I whispered, cradling her gently as I stood. I've got you. Behind me, Laura appeared, her weapon drawn as she approached the man I'd cuffed. She quickly took custody of him, her expression grim. You okay? She asked, her eyes flicking to the blood dripping down my arm. I'll live, I replied, my focus still on Emily. Let's get her out of here. As we walked back toward the motel, Emily's grip on me never loosened. She buried her face in my shoulder, her small frame still trembling but slowly beginning to relax. The weight of the night hung heavily over all of us. But as I carried Emily toward the safety of the waiting cruisers, one thought kept me going: she was safe. And I wasn't going to let anything take that away from her again. The ride back to the precinct was heavy with silence. Emily sat in the back seat of my cruiser, still clutching her doll as if it were the only anchor holding her steady. Her small frame was slumped, and every now and then, I caught her glancing at me through the rearview mirror. I'd smile softly each time, hoping to reassure her, but I knew it would take more than a few kind gestures to undo the fear she'd endured. The cuffs on James Walters's wrists clicked as Laura led him into the station, his accomplice following close behind under another officer's watch. Walters had finally gone quiet, his earlier protests replaced with a hollow, defeated silence. But his accomplice, the man from the woods, still sneered as if he knew something we didn't. I stayed with Emily while Laura and the others processed the suspects. The precinct was mostly empty this time of night, but a child psychologist had been called in to sit with Emily, helping her navigate the waves of fear and confusion that were likely crashing through her. We settled into one of the quieter rooms, the harsh fluorescent lights replaced by the softer glow of a lamp. Emily perched on the edge of the chair, her hands still gripping the doll. I knelt beside her, my voice low and gentle. Emily, I said, I know tonight has been really scary, but you're safe now. No one's going to hurt you. Do you understand? She nodded, her blonde hair falling into her face. Are you sure? She whispered, her voice fragile, like it might shatter if she spoke too loudly. I placed my hand over hers, careful not to overwhelm her. I promise. Your parents are coming, and they're going to be so happy to see you. Her small lips quivered, and for a moment, I thought she might cry, but instead, she nodded again and clutched her doll even tighter. As Emily sat with the psychologist, I stepped into the observation room next door, where Laura was reviewing the evidence we'd gathered. The ledger from Walters's car was laid out on the table, its grim contents sending a chill through me every time I looked at it. Dozens of entries, names, locations, coded transactions painted a horrifying picture of a child trafficking operation that stretched far beyond what we'd uncovered tonight. Laura glanced up as I entered, her face a mix of exhaustion and determination. It's worse than we thought, she said, tapping the ledger. This isn't just Walters and his accomplice. This is part of something bigger, organized, calculated. And ruthless. They've been operating under the radar for years. I leaned against the table. My jaw tight. How many kids? Laura hesitated. Her fingers brushing the edges of the ledger. We don't know yet. But it's enough to make your stomach turn. I ran a hand through my hair, trying to push back the rising anger. Emily's lucky we got to her in time. How many others weren't so lucky? Laura didn't answer. She didn't need to. We stayed silent for a moment. The weight of what we'd uncovered pressing down on us. Then, finally, Laura spoke. The Amber Alert was confirmed. Emily Harper's parents are on their way. They've been searching for her non-stop since she went missing 3 days ago. They're going to be here in 15 minutes. I nodded, my chest tightening at the thought. Emily had been through so much. But soon, she'd be back with the people who loved her most. That was what mattered. 15 minutes later, I watched from a distance as Emily's parents, Claire and David Harper, rushed into the precinct. Claire's face was pale and tear-streaked, and David's shoulders were tense with worry. Their eyes darted around the room, searching desperately. When they saw Emily, everything else melted away. Emily, Claire cried, running to her daughter and dropping to her knees. Emily's face lit up as she bolted from her chair, her doll tumbling to the floor. "Mommy, Daddy," she shouted, throwing herself into their arms. The reunion was pure, raw emotion. Claire clutched her daughter tightly, sobbing uncontrollably as David wrapped his arms around both of them, his own tears streaming down his face. It was a scene of relief, of love, of a family made whole again. I stayed back, giving them their moment, watching them. I felt a wave of emotions, relief that Emily was safe, gratitude that I'd followed my instincts, and anger at the thought of how close they'd come to losing her forever. Claire eventually looked up, her tear-filled eyes locking on mine. She stood, still holding Emily, and walked over. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Thank you for bringing her back to us." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I just did my job." "No," she said firmly, shaking her head. "You did more than that. You saved her." Emily reached out to me, her small arms wrapping around my neck in a tight hug. "Thank you, Officer Harris," she whispered. I closed my eyes briefly, the weight of her words sinking in. "You're welcome, Emily," I said softly. "You're very brave." As the Harpers left the precinct, their daughter safely in their arms, I stood in the quiet hallway and let out a long breath. Emily was safe. But the fight wasn't over. Walters and his accomplice were just the beginning. The ledger was proof of something far more insidious. And I wouldn't stop until every child in that book was found and brought home. Tonight, we'd won. But tomorrow, the battle would continue. And I was ready. The precinct hummed with subdued energy the next morning as we worked to piece together the full scope of what we had uncovered. The early sunlight streamed through the narrow windows, casting a pale glow over the mountain of evidence spread across the conference table. The ledger from Walters's possession sat at the center of it all, its worn pages brimming with names, numbers, and coded transactions. Each line told a story of pain, loss, and cruelty, children taken, families shattered, and lives forever changed. It was a grim map of their operations, and Laura and I were determined to use it to tear the entire network apart. Detectives from Ridgewood PD had arrived to assist with the investigation, and the room buzzed with quiet urgency as teams compared notes and shared leads. But even amidst the flurry of activity, my mind kept drifting back to Emily's face, her trembling hands clutching her doll, her wide eyes pleading for safety. "She was lucky," Laura said, breaking my thoughts as she slid into the seat next to me. "Not every kid in that book will get the same chance." I nodded, my jaw tightening. "But they'll get a chance," I said firmly. "We're going to find them." Laura studied me for a moment, her sharp eyes softening. "You're taking this personally." "Damn right I am," I said, my voice low but resolute. I looked her in the eyes and let her drive away with him. If I hadn't. You stopped her in time. Laura interrupted. Her tone firm. That's what matters. Don't let what you almost missed stop you from seeing what you did right. I didn't respond. But her words stuck with me. Later that morning, Walters and his accomplice, now identified as Matthew Carson, were brought into the interrogation room. I stood behind the one-way mirror, watching as Laura took the lead. Walters sat slouched in his chair, his cuffed hands resting on the metal table. The smugness he'd shown the night before was gone, replaced by a sullen, defiant stare. Beside him, Carson was visibly shaken, his eyes darting nervously around the room. Laura leaned forward, her voice sharp and unwavering. You've got nowhere to hide, Walters. We have enough evidence to bury you. The forged documents, the passports, the ledger, your entire operation is laid out in front of us. Walters didn't flinch. You think you've got it all figured out, don't you? He said, his tone dripping with disdain. But you don't know how this world works. I know how you work. Laura shot back. You abduct children, forge documents to make it look like they're yours, and then sell them to the highest bidder. You're not a mastermind, Walters. You're a predator. Carson squirmed in his seat, clearly uncomfortable. But Walters remained stoic. You think this ends with me? Walters said, leaning back in his chair. You're wasting your time. Even if you shut me down, there are others. You'll never stop all of us. Laura's gaze didn't waver. Maybe not all of you, but enough to make a difference. And I'll start by making sure you never see the outside of a prison cell again. I clenched my fists as I listened, the rage simmering beneath my calm exterior. Walters's arrogance, his complete lack of remorse, it was infuriating. Back in the squad room, I focused on the task at hand. The ledger wasn't just evidence, it was a roadmap. Each name and transaction was a thread in the web Walters and his network had spun, and it was our job to unravel it. As the day wore on, more arrests were made. Tips from Ridgewood PD and neighboring counties led to the discovery of safe houses and meeting points linked to the operation. 4 children were rescued that day, their frightened faces haunting yet hopeful as they were reunited with their families. That evening, as I sat at my desk reviewing case files, a familiar voice pulled me from my work. Michael. I looked up to see Laura standing in the doorway, her expression a mix of exhaustion and pride. We've got enough to charge Walters and Carson with kidnapping, conspiracy, and trafficking. Their arraignment is tomorrow morning. I nodded, the weight in my chest easing slightly. Good. They deserve every second of what's coming. She stepped closer, setting a cup of coffee on my desk. You did good work, Michael. Emily's safe because of you. I shook my head, my gaze dropping to the file in front of me. It's not enough, Laura. There are still kids out there. Still families who don't know if their children are alive. And we're going to find them, she said firmly. But we can't do it all in one day. Tonight. Take the win. Her words hung in the air as she left. And for the first time since the ordeal began, I allowed myself to exhale. Emily Harper was home, safe with her family. Walters and Carson were behind bars, and the wheels of justice were turning. But this was just the beginning. The fight wasn't over, and until every child in that ledger was found, I wouldn't rest. The courtroom was quiet, save for the steady murmurs of journalists lining the back row, their pens and cameras poised to capture every detail. Stephen Walters and Matthew Carson sat at the defense table, their expressions a mixture of defiance and unease. Walters, always the more composed of the two, wore a mask of hollow arrogance, while Carson's darting eyes betrayed his growing panic. The trial had lasted weeks, with every detail of their operation brought to light. Each forged document, every coded ledger entry, and the testimony of the families they had torn apart painted a picture so horrifying that the weight of it seemed to press down on everyone in the room. I sat in the gallery, my arm still in a sling from the scuffle in the woods. I hadn't wanted to come to the sentencing. But something inside me insisted I see it through. This wasn't just about justice, it was about closure for Emily, for her family, and for all the children whose names filled that ledger. The jury filed in, their faces solemn as they took their seats. The judge called the court to order, and the room fell silent. My chest tightened as the jury foreman rose, clearing his throat before reading the verdict. In the case of Stephen Walters and Matthew Carson, we find the defendants guilty on all counts, including kidnapping, conspiracy, and child trafficking. A collective gasp rippled through the courtroom, followed by a few quiet sobs from the families present. I glanced at Claire and David Harper, seated a few rows ahead of me. Claire was crying softly, clutching David's hand as he closed his eyes, his face a mask of quiet relief. The judge delivered the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial. Walters's expression didn't falter, but Carson's head dropped, his shoulders sagging under the weight of the verdict. It was over. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for comments, their voices a cacophony of questions and demands. I slipped past them unnoticed, my focus on the next steps. Walters and Carson were behind bars, but the work was far from done. Back at the precinct, the mood was a mix of satisfaction and determination. The evidence uncovered during the investigation had led to a series of raids across multiple states. Every arrest, every child rescued, was a victory. But it also reminded us how far the network stretched. Laura found me at my desk that afternoon, dropping a thick folder in front of me. 3 more arrests last night, she said, her voice tinged with cautious optimism. And 4 kids found. We're making progress. I opened the folder, scanning the photos and reports inside. Each child's face told a story of resilience, their eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Good, I said, though my tone was subdued. It's a start. She studied me for a moment, then leaned against the edge of my desk. You should feel proud, Michael. This case wouldn't have broken open without you. I shook my head, leaning back in my chair. It's not about me, Laura. It's about those kids. Emily and all the others. They're the ones who matter. She didn't push, but I could see the understanding in her eyes. Then let's keep going, she said simply. A few weeks later, I found myself in the park near my neighborhood. It was a rare day off, and I'd come here to clear my head. The sound of children laughing on the swings and climbing the jungle gym was a welcome change from the grim realities of the precinct. I was lost in thought when I heard a small, familiar voice. Officer Harris. I turned and saw Emily Harper running toward me, her blonde hair catching the sunlight. She was holding her doll, though its dress had been mended and its stuffing seemed fuller, as if someone had lovingly restored it. Behind her, Claire and David Harper followed, carrying a picnic basket and waving when they saw me. Emily reached me first, throwing her arms around my waist in a hug. I missed you, she exclaimed, looking up at me with a bright smile that warmed my heart. I crouched down to her level. I missed you too, Emily. How are you doing? Good, she said proudly. Mommy and Daddy take me to the park now. And I'm starting school again soon. That's great to hear, I said, smiling at her. You're a brave girl. You know that. Claire and David caught up, both of them smiling, though Claire's eyes glistened with unshed tears. We can never thank you enough, she said, her voice thick with emotion. You don't need to thank me, I said, standing. Just keep being the amazing parents you are. That's all Emily needs. David extended his hand, and I shook it firmly. You're a good man, Harris, he said. If there's ever anything we can do for you, just say the word. Emily tugged on my sleeve, her eyes shining with a mixture of gratitude and innocence. Thank you for saving me, she said softly. I crouched down again, placing a hand on her shoulder. You're welcome. Emily. But don't forget, you're the brave one. As they walked away, Emily skipping happily between her parents, I felt a rare sense of peace settle over me. That evening, back on patrol, the streets stretched out before me, bathed in the warm glow of streetlights. I scanned every shadow, every corner, knowing how quickly danger could strike. But I also knew the difference one decision could make, the lives it could save. This fight wasn't over. But moments like Emily's smile reminded me why it was worth it. Every single time. In the end, the case was a powerful reminder of the strength of human resilience and the importance of never giving up hope. Emily Harper was safe, her family whole again, and the tireless efforts of the team brought justice. The fight, however, was far from over. Each name in the ledger represented a child waiting to be found, a family yearning for answers. For Officer Harris and his team, this was just the beginning. Their determination to dismantle the network and bring every child home became there. Moments like Emily's smile and the gratitude of families like hers made the struggle worthwhile. It wasn't just about enforcing the law, it was about restoring hope. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more about courage, love, and the profound lessons life teaches us, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to Life Stories.